This week I reached out to members of our congregation and some friends of mine, and I asked them what spiritual growth looks like in their life. So I wanted to get a sense from their point of view about how they would know if they were developing in their religious and spiritual life. How would you know if you were moving along the path closer to the type of relationship with humanity and with the divine that they wanted to have? And I got back a variety of answers. Some people said that they knew they were developing if they were being involved in work that made them forget themselves. The other half said they knew where they were developing if they knew who they were more. About half the people said that they were quite challenged by the everyday relationships and obligations and schedules, that felt like a barrier to their spiritual growth. And about just as many people said that the most helpful thing for them in developing their spiritual life were their everyday relationships and their normal obligations. But one of the things that showed up over and over again that I found interesting was just how many people said that the biggest obstacle to their spiritual development was them. I had more than a few people respond back to me and say, if I could just get out of my own way. Anybody? No? Me. I'm glad that I got back such a wide variety of responses because it gives voice to this tension that I feel maybe particularly in our congregation and our religious tradition, but also in American society. It's the idea that we don't have a real solid grasp of what spirituality means or what it would look like to grow along that path. There's just so many ideas. It's a pretty ambiguous thing. All you have to do is go to a local bookstore and walk through the religion and spirituality section and see how many divergent views and opinions that you get. Spend 6 or 8 weeks traveling to a different religious congregation here in Dallas and ask the people that you meet, what would it look like for me to grow in my spiritual life, and see the variety of answers. As I looked around on websites of local congregations and looked around this week here in Dallas, I saw a range of answers that went all the way from one rigid path that offered a single answer to a lot of problems, to suggestions that I experiment and get in dialogue with others. I see something that looks like asceticism, and some suggestions that the religious life is just another thing to consume. I see self-denial and self-actualization and almost everything in between. Now, I think this is a challenge for a religious community like ours because for many centuries, but especially now, we've known that whatever God is, it's bigger than any one human being's ability to comprehend the holy. So we ask for many points of view. We ask to be in dialogue. We want a variety of perspectives, and we acknowledge that the light of holy wisdom shines through many windows. However, in the midst of all of that, I think that there are some things at the core of the spiritual journey. I think no matter how we name it, no matter what context the life comes from, for me, genuine spiritual growth is about an intentional growing in relationship with creation itself. It's about a lifelong practice of growing in a meaningful, participatory relationship with all that is. Now that's big. When I use that term, spiritual growth, I mean a participatory experience with reality over the course of a lifetime where I know who I am in the midst of all creation, where I feel a kinship with the stars themselves, where I grow in an understanding of what I'm called to do and who I'm called to be. But that's a lot to say in one sentence. So I normally just say spiritual growth. So we'll use that as a shorthand for the rest of the sermon. Now, I'm sure that you know as well as I do that there are plenty of obstacles in what it means to grow in being more fully human. I'm sure you've got a long list of what those obstacles are for you. But in my experience, I found that actually one of the things that keeps me from growing in the way that I want to are the ways that we measure success in our culture. I look and I see what the spiritual person looks like in my mind. When I imagine someone that has reached a level of insight and depth in their spiritual life, it's like this silent yogi perched on a mountaintop somewhere, having been in silent meditation for 20 years. I imagine a teacher kneeling beside the feet of the poor. I imagine selfless acts of courage which seem beyond my ability. I get this version of somebody who looks not a lot like me. I think it's easy for us to set up these models of perfection. Now, it's nice to have models that we follow. It's a good thing to say, I want to be like this person. But when we start to believe that our job in our moral cultivation or our spiritual lives is to turn ourselves into somebody else, or if we believe that those people we'd like to be are perfect, we are in for a surprise. I do remember growing up in congregations here in Dallas as a young child and being very confused about how the person of Jesus was explained to me. I remember week after week hearing that this was the model human life. And I wanted, even as a young person, so badly to be able to live up to that ideal and to live like the person whose stories I heard over and over, and why not? But I also remember hearing that he was fully God and fully human, a perfect expression of humanity on earth, and I was fully human, fully Aaron. And I remember even as a boy seeing the comparison between my human life and this perfect example and feeling like my own faults were almost insurmountable. One method of comparing ourselves is to the saints. I think also we get this message in our culture that's called the prosperity gospel. It doesn't just come from Christianity, it's also in New Age thought and even the good old Protestant work ethic. It's the idea that if you're living your moral and religious life in the correct fashion, you will be healthy and wealthy. That the lack of problems in your life is evidence of your spiritual success. As if this thing was ever not going to be messy. As if the waters were not going to be troubled. And of course, I think we face an even more subtle form of perfectionism in that nagging sense I get that I can use my consumer identity to make all the right ethical choices. If I can just find the locally farmed, non-GMO organic milk, I won't be culpable for humanity's ills. If I can just get my Prius to Whole Foods fast enough, if I can just use my bank account, which is filled with money from a sustainably developed religious organization, I could be exempt from blame. I could be exempt from the messiness of human life. That's not working. I get the sense when I talk to people that what progress in the spiritual life looks like is always far, far away, because so often it looks like becoming someone we're not. That reading this morning portrays the spiritual situation of so many of us like a young boy trying to learn how to play the piano. In his innocence, he starts off by just liking how it sounds. It's that sense that there's something beautiful to be had there. He loves the way that his fingers feel on the keys, the sound the piano makes. He's seen someone play it very well once, and it inspired him to be like them. So he practices and starts to play in front of other people and is happy and feels good to do so until he becomes aware of his mistakes. Other people become aware of his mistakes. He starts to realize that he'll never be perfect, that he'll never play just like that person who inspired him. And like so many of us, he doesn't throw the whole thing out the window, he just stops trying. He says, "This is as good as I'll ever be." And in the reading, it says that he builds these walls around himself. He starts to say, I'm limited in these ways where limits didn't used to exist, and he's afraid to challenge himself because he's afraid he'll be mocked, or that he'll fail, or that he'll figure out he wasn't the person he thought he was. He's right. When we meet these limits of what we think we're capable of, the goodness in our hearts, our relationship with creation itself and the holy, we won't hit the mark all the time. And we will be mocked for our ambition. And we will sometimes find out that we're not the people we think we are. And that's okay. Because being successful in this doesn't look like being a carbon copy of any other human being who has ever existed on the planet. It's like when two people go to the gym, both with the hopes of becoming healthy, and you think that success means looking just like that guy on the treadmill next to me who looks like a Grecian statue. Healthy is healthy. And all of us can move forward in progress, but the spiritual life isn't a factory. It's not an assembly line. And we can't promise you that you're going to come out of many years in this congregation looking exactly like anybody else. You know, I picked that reading about the young boy learning to play piano this morning before I knew it was Jazz Sunday, and it was a happy coincidence. And it reminded me of a moment where I got some unexpected spiritual teaching. My wife Kate and I, shortly after our wedding, went on a kind of typical island vacation. And one night, we walked into a little piano bar that was at the place where we were staying. And with a few other couples and the aptly named Gilbert behind the piano, we stayed up late one night singing show tunes and jazz standards. And there was a point in the evening where Gilbert wanted to teach me how to play jazz piano. And I remember he would almost kind of move my hand onto the keys, and I didn't want to press down because people were watching, and I'd take some lessons when I was a kid, but I wasn't really sure about this whole thing. And he turned to me and said, "Hey, look, there are no wrong notes. It's not the note you play that makes it wrong or right. It's the note after that one. It's how you follow up," he said. I remember at the end of the night leaning toward Gilbert and saying, "Gilbert, my friend, thanks for the sermon." Now, it's not a flawless analogy, but I think there's something in there that works. It's not about whether or not you're going to fall short of the mark, whether or not your hands are going to slip, you're going to do and say things that fall short of that goal of who you want to be. It's about whether or not you're willing to keep trying. Whether or not you will stop and say, "I can never be this person, so I'm not going to try." Or whether or not you measure your deepening relationship with creation itself based on you. If we, in this religious community, attempt meaningful things, we're going to fail from time to time. If we're actually trying to be the kind of human beings who would participate in building the beloved community on earth, those kind of human beings, our hands are going to slip, we are going to be imperfect, we're going to play wrong notes, whatever Gilbert says. But I think that if we're not challenged, if we don't feel ourselves coming up against those limits, if we don't have those moments of self-doubt, it's probably evidence that we're not setting the bar high enough for who we could be in this place. Because there is so much work to do. I'm assuming that by your presence here, you want to grow and change and develop. That you at least have this stirring in you that wants to be a part of building the beloved community on earth, practicing heaven. Because if all you want to do is be entertained here or learn information, there are better places to go and get only those two things. This will be hard. But it's worth it. Because if we move closer toward that goal of the type of community we want to be, and if we inch our way closer to the type of human beings we want to be, we can start to address the very real injustices that are alive and well in our community, in our town. But if we wait, to become active players in that process until we are perfect. It's going to be too late. So if the spiritual life is about developing a meaningful, participatory relationship with creation itself, we're in for some disappointment if we think that our growth looks like any other human being that's ever existed. So maybe in the next few weeks, you'll catch yourself when you start to think, I'm not really as good as they are. I can't do this as well as I've seen before. When you start to hold yourself to impossible standards, or perhaps when you hold other people to impossible standards, you'll stop and ask, not is my worth determined by am I perfect or am I making mistakes, but maybe a different set of questions. 4 things in particular on my mind right now: humility, relationship, gratitude, and service. I think that's because we're in an election year when humility, relationship, gratitude, and service seem far off. But perhaps instead of asking yourself, am I perfect, you can ask yourself, is the way that I'm intentionally living helping me be more humble? Is it deepening my relationships? Do I recognize the gifts of life, and do I feel called to respond in service to the world? The question of humility means, over the course of the last few years, do you think you're more curious or more cynical? Do you feel like you really know all you need to know about them? Or each year along the path, do you realize all you don't know? The question of relationship asks whether or not over the last few years you've been able to see a kinship among all human beings beyond our labels. Is it easier for you to be in relationship with other people? Is it easier for them to be in relationship with you? That's a hard one. The question, am I growing in gratitude, is one that asks whether or not over the last few months and weeks and years, are you measuring life by its injuries or by its gifts? Are you taking time and learning what it means to say out loud all of the things we benefit from that we could never, ever buy or earn or deserve? The question of service, is the way I'm living helping me to grow in service, asks whether or not your relationship with creation is a two-way street. Each year, do you get a better sense of how you're called to give back to life? Is the journey a challenging one that asks something of you? Does it ask you to serve? All you have to do when you leave the sanctuary this morning to get an understanding of how easy it is to measure ourselves against others is turn on the television or go to the bookstore or read the newspaper. We get so many ways of measuring the worth of a human life and our progress, so many of which are not helpful at all. So in whatever way you grow, and in whatever imperfect, quirky, beautiful way that you navigate the next few months and years of your life, I pray that you do grow in humility, in relationship, in gratitude, and in service all the days of your life. Amen.